At the outset of any study of the United States, particularly one that concerns a president such as Franklin Delano Roosevelt, we need to really establish in our minds exactly how the American political system operates, and that's what this video is about. Now, we're going to see cartoons a lot that have a similar theme to this one, and we'll be playing with this source a little in class and a little in the flip videos. But at this very early stage, I'd like to point out to you that while Roosevelt was perhaps one of the most popular American presidents, his popularity wasn't universal. There were plenty of people in the United States who were quite hostile to Roosevelt, particularly around 1936-37, when the presidency, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt as president, came into conflict with the Supreme Court of the United States. We need to understand the powers of a president, and we need to understand how those powers are limited by other branches of the US government. And that's what this video is about. Firstly, we need to understand some basics. The United States is a representative democracy. Like Australia, American voters vote for representatives who serve them in parliamentary type bodies. Like Australia, the United States is a federal system of government. It's a federation, a nation of states, and a nation that has a central government. They refer to it as the federal government, like we do in Australia, or our Commonwealth government. A federal national government that share power. So a federal system where states and a national government share power. The United States is a republic. Australia technically isn't a republic. Australia is a constitutional monarchy. And our monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, reigns over Australia, but in a very detached way. In many respects, Australia acts as if it's a republic. A republic chooses its head of state. This can be directly or indirectly. In the United States, the head of state is the United States President. All of the arrangements in this system of government are defined by the United States Constitution, largely written by Thomas Jefferson in 1776, signed in Philadelphia. The governments, including the state governments of the United States, derive their just powers, their powers to act in just ways, from the people as a democracy. To ensure that it survives as a democracy, the United States separates the powers of government into different branches. This concept is known as the doctrine of the separation of powers. And in Australia, we have the same doctrine applying here, as does Britain. It's an Enlightenment idea that came out from Baron Montesquieu, one of the Enlightenment philosophers. These branches of governments involved in the United States: a strong executive branch, a strong Congress, legislative branch, and a strong judicial branch. So an executive exists with checks and balances on its power provided by the Congress and the courts, the judiciary. The Congress, the US Parliament, and the judiciary, represented by the Supreme Court of the United States, have oversight. They can call each other into account. So they're referred to as being co-equal branches of government: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branches of government. And in the United States, the legislative branch of the federal government is called Congress. The executive branch is represented by the presidency, in charge of all of what we would refer to as the public service, all of the government executive functions, those who carry out the law. And the judicial function, at its highest point, is led by the Supreme Court of the United States. Let's talk a little bit about the Legislative Assembly of the United States. The Congress is, like most Australian parliaments, bicameral. It has two chambers, an upper and a lower chamber of Parliament, chamber of Congress. Their upper house is a states house. It's meant to represent the interests of the different United States to ensure federalism, and that's known as the Senate. They derive the name from the days of ancient Rome. The lower house, the house in which people of local districts vote for representatives, is known as the House of Representatives. These two names were taken for the new Australian Parliament in 1901. When we think of the presidency, we think of the White House, POTUS, President of the US, President of the United States. But the presidency, the executive function of the United States, the executive branch of the United States, is more than that. The president appoints cabinet secretaries. In Australia, we'd refer to those as ministers. Famously, we have a Secretary of Defence and a Secretary of State. These are ministers in Australia and Britain. We use different words. But it also involves different government departments, federal government departments, such as the Post Office, such as the Education Department, the Defence Department. If you are employed by the United States government, you're in the executive branch of the government. If you're elected, you're in the legislative branch. They have some unusual names. For example, the head of the United States Postal Service is the Postmaster General. The head of the branch of government that looks after laws, law and order, is, largely speaking, the Attorney General. The head of the Health Department is the Surgeon General of the United States. But generally speaking, they're known as secretaries. Secretary of Education, Secretary of State, and so on. Our judiciary, led by the Supreme Court of the United States, has a bench of court justices, and over time their number has changed. There's currently 9 of them. It helps to have an uneven number so you don't have drawed votes when the judges make their decisions. They are 8 associate justices and 1 chief justice of the Supreme Court. Back in 1776 or thereabouts, there were 6 justices. 7, then 9, then 10 by the 1860s. Then they were reduced to 7 and again increased to 9. We're currently at 9. Let's now look at these concepts just a little bit more in detail. We have a separation of powers. The United States has a strong executive function and congressional judicial oversight, and they are meant to be co-equal, working with each other. Broadly speaking, in understanding the United States, Congress makes laws. It has oversight over the presidency. It has a system of committees that meet to check on what the executive does. It can confirm and it can reject justices, this is in the Senate, to the Supreme Court, but it can't nominate. It can impeach, indict, and it can convict a sitting president or a justice of the Supreme Court. It can declare war with a 2/3 majority, or the Senate can create a treaty with a 2/3 majority. The president can't make a law. The most he can do is carry out an executive order, sign an executive order, as long as that order is consistent with the law. He reports to both houses of Congress every year in the State of the Union address. He's held to account. He has to offer an official report. He can veto any law that comes through Congress. So Congress can make law, the president can't, but it won't actually be a law until the president gives it his seal of approval, his assent. If he doesn't do that, he can veto it. He can just send it back. The president nominates justices to the Supreme Court, but he can't sack them. He nominates his own cabinet, including a vice president. And when the president dies, if he dies in office, the vice president takes over. Article 2 of the Constitution of the United States gives the president external powers to deal with foreign countries. He also has a number of implied powers, and he is considered the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, and now the Air Force, and so on. The Supreme Court can't make laws, it can't make orders, but it can make rulings on the law. It is the final appeal jurisdiction in the United States. If you've got a question about the Constitution, it is the original jurisdiction. It is the starting point of all law for the states and international laws. If a state wants to sue the federal government, it'll end up in the Supreme Court. If there's a dispute between the United States and another country, it'll often end up in the United States Supreme Court. You don't need any qualifications to be a justice of the Supreme Court. You don't have to even be a lawyer. And those justices shall hold their offices during good behaviour. Generally speaking, that means if they don't stuff up, they can stay a justice of the Supreme Court. That often means their lifetime appointments, unless they're impeached by Congress and convicted by Congress, they resign or they retire in office. So here's a few revision questions for you to consider based upon that, and we'll see that diagram later on.